The first thing you notice, coming back to yourself this evening, is the smell. It is always the smell, in this place. Dried chamomile and beeswax and the faintest thread of something resinous. Perhaps the pine oil soap you used to clean the counter this morning, or perhaps just the natural exhale of a room that has held so many herbs for so many years that the very walls have become fragrant. You have stopped being able to tell the difference. You are not sure it matters. You are standing just inside the door of the shop, still in your coat, one hand resting on the latch behind you. The bell above the door, a small brass thing, shaped like a leaf, has just finished its soft ringing. The sound of it fades into the room the way all sounds fade in here, gradually, like something being gently lowered into water. You stay there for a moment. Just there, in the doorway, with the warmth of the interior beginning to reach you after the cool of the walk over. There is something in these first few seconds inside the shop, something that happens every time, whether you have been gone an hour or a full day, that you have never quite found words for. It is not exactly relief. It is not exactly homecoming, though it is something like both. It is more that the shop has a quality of reception, perhaps, of knowing you are here, of rearranging itself around you very slightly, the way a room that is used to you does. The amber bottles on the upper shelves. The dark worn wood of the counter. The stool for customers, angled slightly away from the counter the way it always is, because no one who sits there ever thinks to push it straight, and you have never thought to push it straight either. The smell of everything the room has ever held, layered over years into something that is simply, specifically, the smell of this place and no other. You breathe it in. Outside, the lane is quiet. It is early evening, and the sky over Sable Street has gone the color of a bruised plum, deep purple at the edges, fading to a dull amber where the last of the daylight still clings to the roofline of the chandlery across the way. You can smell, even from inside, that the air has that particular quality it gets in late autumn, cool and slightly sweet, like dried leaves and wet stone, like the world folding itself in for the night. The street lamps on Sable Street have just come on. You can see the one directly across from the shop window, its flame new and still settling, throwing a warm unsteady circle onto the wet cobblestones below. The cobblestones are always wet this time of year, or nearly always. The damp comes in off the harbor in the mornings and never quite dries before the next morning brings more. You have walked these cobblestones in all weathers, in all seasons, and they are as familiar to you as the floor of your own kitchen. The particular uneven one just outside the shop door that catches the right heel if you're not paying attention. The broader stretch further down the lane that collects a long shallow puddle when it rains. You know them all. The chandler across the lane closed some time ago. His window is dark. From further down the street, you think from somewhere around the corner toward the harbor, there is the faint smell of something being cooked, fish and something aromatic underneath. The thistle and tide, perhaps, with its early dinner trade. The smell drifts and fades. You let the door close behind you. Tomorrow is the harvest fair. You have known it was coming for weeks, of course. There is no missing the preparations in Market Square, the banners being hung between the lamp-posts, the sound of Bramble Oast hauling extra chairs from the inn cellar every morning. But today it arrived in a different way. Today it arrived in the form of a list, written in your own handwriting some weeks ago, tucked under a small amber bottle on the back shelf. The list that says, Fair Bottles, 12, Sleep Draught, Clarity Tonic, Grief Ease, Something New if Time. You have the time tonight. And so you are here, back in the shop after supper, coat still on, letting your eyes adjust to the low light. The shop feels different in the evenings when you are alone in it. During the day there is a particular energy to the place. The bell ringing, the sound of customers settling onto the stool, the small negotiations of what someone needs versus what they think they need. In the evening, the shop breathes differently. More slowly. The amber bottles on the upper shelves catch the candlelight from the street and glow softly, like embers. The shadows under the counter are deep and comfortable. The only sound is the faint creak of the buildings settling around you, and somewhere further down the lane, the distant note of the Harbour Bell beginning to ring the 7th hour. 7. You have the whole evening ahead of you. You take off your coat and hang it on the hook by the door, the hook that has always been a little crooked, leaning to the left just enough that coats have a tendency to slide toward the wall. You have never fixed it. It would feel wrong, somehow, to change it now. The back room is where the real work happens. You push through the curtain, a heavy wool thing in deep green, slightly moth-eaten at one corner, which you have also never fixed, and into the smaller space behind the counter. Here the shelves are different. Less arranged, more alive. The jars are larger back here, unlabeled or labeled in pencil, and many of them are open, or stopped with cloth rather than proper corks. Bundles of herbs hang from the low ceiling on lengths of twine, dried lavender and rosemary and meadowsweet and something purplish you have been experimenting with for the past 3 weeks that hasn't got a name yet, in your personal system at least. The workbench runs along the back wall. It is a long piece of old oak, worn smooth in the places where you have stood and worked for years, slightly rough still at the edges where no one ever stands. There are rings on the wood from hot mugs set down carelessly over decades. Not your decades, but someone else's, someone who worked this bench before you. You have always found those rings comforting. Evidence of a long, ordinary life. The back room smells differently than the front of the shop. Not more strongly, just differently. There is a rawness to it back here that the front room doesn't have. The front is the smell of things composed and completed. The back is the smell of things in process, the deeper, earthier smell of jars opened and herbs crushed and tinctures beginning their slow work. There is the faint, sharp smell of the valerian, always, even corked. It bleeds through its bottle the way certain strong things do, announcing itself quietly. There is the warmer smell of the dried lemon balm on the 3rd shelf, which you notice when you walk past it the same way you notice a friend's familiar perfume. And underneath all of it, the old smell of the bench itself. Years of heat and moisture and work, soaked into the grain of the wood until the oak and the work are inseparable. You light the lamp on the bench first. It is an oil lamp with a clouded glass chimney, and the flame inside it is a particular warm orange that you have never seen replicated anywhere else in town. Something about the oil, maybe, or the glass. It fills the back room with a honey-colored light that softens everything it touches, and you feel the day begin to leave your shoulders as you stand there for a moment just watching the flame settle. The flame does a small restless dance when it first catches, reaching and flickering, adjusting to the draft of the room, and then, as you watch, it finds its shape. It narrows and steadies, becomes that particular upright oval you know so well, and gives its warm orange light without any further comment. Then you light the small brazier in the corner. The one with the iron feet shaped like curled leaves that you have always meant to ask someone the history of. The coals in it are already laid from this morning. You have a good habit of preparing things the night before, which is fortunate, given the situation. You touch a long match to the coals and watch the flame catch and spread, reddening the edges of the coals, filling the room with a low, soft sound of something beginning to burn. The brazier will take a quarter of an hour to reach the heat you need. You are in no hurry. While you wait, you walk the room. This is something you do before beginning any significant work. A kind of quiet inventory, though not written down, nothing so formal. You walk the length of the workbench and check what is where. You check the level of the chamomile in the bag. You'll need it tonight and you want to know the reserves are sufficient. You check the valerian tincture and confirm the cork is properly in. You run a hand along the hanging herbs overhead, the lavender, the rosemary, the dried meadowsweet with its faint powdery sweetness. The purplish herb you haven't named yet. You pinch a small amount of it between your fingers and smell, and it gives up something floral and green and slightly strange, and you are still not quite sure what to do with it, but you are certain it wants to do something. It has that quality. The kettle on its hook above the brazier. The steeping bowls, stacked in size order on the far shelf. The mortar and pestle on the left side of the bench, with a faint reddish stain in the stone bowl from some tincture work earlier in the week that wouldn't quite come out in washing. The labels, already prepared for 10 of the 12 bottles and stacked neatly in the corner of the bench under a small smooth stone that serves as a paperweight. Everything is here. Everything is as it should be. While you begin to gather. The bottles are in a crate under the bench. 12 of them, small ones, the kind that fit comfortably in a palm. They are a pale green glass, slightly irregular in shape, the way hand-blown glass always is. You lift them out one at a time and set them on the bench in a row. In the lamp's warm light, they look like a collection of small lanterns, each one catching a slightly different angle of the glow. You check each one for cracks out of habit, holding them up to the light and turning them slowly. They are all fine. You set them in their row and step back and look at them. 12 bottles. 3 sleep draught, 3 clarity tonic, 3 grief ease, and 3 of whatever feels right tonight. You roll up your sleeves. The sleep draught is the one you know best. You have been making it for long enough that your hands remember it even when your mind wanders elsewhere, which it does, often, pleasantly, while you work. You know the weight of the dried lemon balm, how it feels between your fingers when it's properly dry versus still carrying a little moisture. You know the exact color the chamomile gives the water once it has steeped long enough, a pale gold, warmer than simple water but paler than tea. You know how much of the valerian root tincture to add, which is a small amount, barely more than a few drops, because it has a tendency to overpower everything else if you are not careful, and the goal is not sedation, the goal is softness. A gentle lowering. You begin to measure. The lemon balm goes into the steeping bowl first. It crumbles as it always does between your fingers, releasing its smell into the air. Something clean and slightly citrusy and green, even dried, even in autumn. You add it to the bowl and then stand over it for a moment with your eyes half closed, just breathing. The lemon balm has a quality that you noticed the first time you worked with it, years ago now, before you had fully understood what you were doing in the shop or what these blends were meant to accomplish. Even then, before you had any words for it, you noticed that the act of preparing lemon balm was itself calming. The smell of it, the texture of it, something about the way it crumbles so willingly, gives itself up so completely to the bowl. You have thought about this over the years. Whether the herbs know, in their particular vegetable way, what they are for. Whether lemon balm, specifically, carries a kind of intention. You have never reached a firm conclusion. You tend not to. But you have continued to find the preparation of it settling, every time, and to allow that without questioning it further. The water from the kettle on the brazier is hot but not boiling. You have learned, through trial and a few gentle failures, that boiling water dulls certain things. There is a temperature at which the herbs give their best, generous but not overwhelmed. You pour the water slowly, in a thin stream, watching it spread through the lemon balm and darken the herbs to a deeper green. Steam rises from the bowl, carrying the smell upward into the room. You set the kettle back on the brazier hook and rest your hands on the edge of the bench. Just for a moment. Watching the bowl. The steam drifts slowly upward and disperses in the warm room. The herbs move in the small currents of the water, settling slowly into the steep. There is something meditative about this part, the watching. You have tried, over the years, to find ways to speed this process and found that the results were always slightly lesser, and that this particular lesson has been one of the harder ones to keep in mind. The herbs steep in their own time. The kettle heats at its own pace. The bottles come out right when you let them, and less right when you rush. While it steeps you turn to the chamomile. Greenmere's apothecary across the square sells chamomile in neat paper packets, tied with string. Yours comes in a rough woven bag that old Marin Ashby brought you from the inland market sometime in late summer. A whole bag of it, dried, perfect, smelling faintly of sunshine and dry grass and the particular sweetness of chamomile that has been dried slowly rather than rushed. You have been careful with it. You measure out the amount you need for 3 bottles and place it into a second smaller bowl, and you find yourself already making a note to ask Marin if there is more where that came from, because you are getting through it faster than expected. The chamomile from Greenmere's is fine. You have nothing against it. But there is a quality to this particular batch, you have noticed it throughout the autumn, that is difficult to name. It might be in the way it was dried. It might be in the soil it came from, some inland meadow with good mineral content in the ground. It might be nothing you can point to at all. It might simply be that this is an excellent year for chamomile and you were fortunate to have someone who thought to bring you a bag. Whatever the reason, the sleep draughts this season have been some of the best you have made, and you are aware that part of that is simply the chamomile, doing what chamomile does very well. The shop breathes around you. The brazier crackles once, softly, and settles into a steady low sound. Somewhere outside, faint enough to be almost imagined, you can hear the distant murmur of the harbor, the slow movement of water against stone. It is a sound that is simply always there in Thistlewick, a low constant note in everything. You have lived here long enough that you only notice it in quiet moments like this one, and every time you do notice it there is a small settling in your chest, as though your body recognizes it the way you might recognize a familiar voice. You add the chamomile to its bowl. More steam. The 2 bowls side by side on the bench, each giving off their separate faint clouds, filling the warm back room with their particular qualities. The lemon balm clean and slightly green, the chamomile sweeter, softer. They complement each other beautifully. They always do. Some herbs seem to be naturally drawn toward each other, the way certain people seem naturally to belong in the same room. The valerian tincture is in a small dark bottle on the second shelf. You keep it toward the back because the smell of it, undiluted, is rather assertive. You bring it to the bench and uncork it and hold it just under your nose, carefully, the way you always do before using it. It smells of deep earth and something faintly medicinal, and underneath those things, something harder to name. Woody. Old. As if the root from which this tincture was made had been growing in the ground for a very long time, absorbing some quiet patience that it is now willing to share. You add the drops. You count them quietly. The combined mixture in the large bowl shifts from gold to something deeper, a warm amber. You fill the 3 sleep draught bottles with the same care you always take, tilting the jug slowly, watching the level rise, leaving just enough space at the neck for the cork to sit cleanly. Each bottle gets its cork pressed in with the heel of your palm, firmly enough to seal, gently enough not to crack the glass. The first bottle. The second. The third. You hold the third bottle up to the lamp for a moment once it is corked. The amber liquid inside catches the light and holds it, warm and translucent, the color of late afternoon in autumn. Beautiful in a quiet way. You set it in the row and take a breath. You are somewhere in the middle of the second batch, the clarity tonic now, which takes considerably more attention than the sleep draught, because the balance of it is finer, when you hear the front door bell. Soft, as always. The leaf-shaped bell makes a sound like a question rather than an announcement. You look up from the bench and push the green curtain aside just enough to see into the front of the shop. It is Marin. She is standing just inside the door in her wide gray shawl, the one she wears from the first cold snap in September through to sometime in April, with only brief interruptions. Her silver hair is pinned up in its usual loose way, with the usual few strands escaping at the sides. She has a basket over one arm, covered with a cloth, and she is looking around the shop with the particular expression she gets sometimes, a kind of gentle taking in, as though she never quite takes the shop for granted. "You're here," she said, spotting you through the curtain. There is no surprise in it, just warmth. As though finding you here is simply what was meant to happen. "I'm here," you said. "Come in, Marin. Mind the box," she said, already stepping around the small wooden crate that has been sitting 2 steps inside the door for the better part of a month. "You have always meant to move it." "I know, dear. I always know." She set the basket down on the counter with a small soft sound and began to lift the cloth from it. "I brought things," she said. "I was cooking anyway, and I thought." She had brought things, yes. There was a small round of cheese wrapped in wax cloth. A half loaf of dark bread, rye, you could smell it, still faintly warm through the wrapping. And in a careful little jar, something preserved. The look and color of it said plums, late plums, the dark ones from the tree at the end of Fenwick Lane. "Marin," you said. "It's nothing," she said, in the way she always says it's nothing, which means she thought about it and wanted to. "You'll be here all evening," I thought. "You should eat." You looked at the jar of plums for a moment. They had a deep reddish-purple color in the low light of the shop, almost jewel-like. The jar had a cloth top tied with kitchen string. "I haven't eaten yet, actually," you admitted. "I know," she said simply. "That's why I brought the bread." You went and lit the candle on the front counter, the fat beeswax one, the one that smells of honey when it burns, and for a while you sat across from each other on either side of the counter while you ate. The bread was good. The cheese was a mild, soft one, crumbly at the edges. The plums from the jar, when you opened it, smelled of late summer and sugar and the particular faint bitterness of the stone fruit, and they were exactly as good as they looked. "Are you coming to the fair tomorrow?" you asked. Marin considered this while she broke off a piece of bread. "For a little while," she said. "I'll come in the morning. I always like it before it gets too full." "It doesn't get that full." "It gets full enough," she said, with the gentle certainty of someone who has attended 20 years' worth of harvest fairs and knows exactly how many people constitute too many. "The Fenwick boys are setting up a game of some kind again this year. Aldemar was telling me about it. I heard. He's very pleased about it," she said. "You know how he gets when he has a project." You did know how Aldemar got when he had a project. There was a particular light that came into the old man's eyes, a kind of focused warmth, like the feeling of sun through glass. "Did he say what kind of game?" "Something with rings," Marin said. "And a post." She paused. He explained it for quite some time, actually. I understood the general idea. You found yourself smiling at the counter. The candle between you made a small wavering oval of light on the worn wood. The clarity tonic is steeping, you said eventually, remembering it. I should check. Go, she said, settling more comfortably onto the stool. I'll sit here. I'm not going anywhere. Back in the workbench room, the clarity tonic had steeped beautifully. You could tell before you even leaned over the bowl. There was a particular smell to it when it was right. Something almost bright, like the air after rain but warmer, more complex. Peppermint was in it, yes, but not the forward sharpness of fresh peppermint. This was dried, and tempered, and there was rosemary too, and something called rivereye that you had discovered some years ago from a very old book with a cracked spine that now lives on the small shelf above your workbench. Rivereye looks like any other unremarkable dried herb, gray-green and papery, but something in it, or perhaps something in the way it works with the rosemary, creates this particular quality of clearness when it is brewed right. Not alertness, exactly. More like the feeling of a window opened on a pleasant day. The sense of air moving, of space, of one's thoughts being gently rearranged into an order that is slightly easier to navigate. You pour the clarity tonic carefully through the fine cloth strainer into the waiting jug, and the liquid that passes through is the color of pale jade. Just exactly right. You begin to fill the first clarity bottle, tilting the jug carefully, watching the liquid rise in the pale green glass. The smell of it comes up with the steam, cool and clean and quietly clarifying, like breathing in something good. It smells wonderful from here, Marin called through the curtain. Come look if you like, you called back. There was a moment's pause, the sound of the stool scraping softly on the stone floor, and then the curtain shifted and Marin appeared at the edge of the back room, staying in the doorway the way she always does, not wanting to crowd your workspace. Her hands were folded over each other, the way she holds them when she is simply watching. The clarity one, she said. You tilted the jug. Rivereye came through well tonight. Sometimes it doesn't. Marin leaned slightly into the room and breathed. I can smell the rosemary, she said. And something else. Something cool. The peppermint. Not that. She thought about it. It smells like morning, she said finally. Early morning. Before the fog burns off. You stopped what you were doing for a moment and considered that. That's exactly right, you said, though you couldn't have said it better yourself. She looked pleased, in the quiet way she gets pleased, a small ease in her expression, a settling. I'll leave you to it, she said, and withdrew. You filled the 3 clarity bottles and corked them carefully and set them in their row. In the lamp's honey light, the 6 bottles so far, the 3 sleep draughts from earlier, the 3 clarity tonics now, looked like something from a painting. The sleep draught ones were that warm amber. The clarity ones were jade. Side by side they were beautiful in a small, unannounced way, the way many things in Thistlewick are beautiful. You could hear the Harbour Bell ringing the 8th hour through the walls of the shop. The Griefy's batch was the one that required the most of you, not in terms of complexity. It was perhaps simpler to make than the clarity tonic, but in terms of attention. You had learned early on, making this one, that your state of mind while preparing it seemed to matter. You weren't certain whether this was true in any rigorous sense, or whether it was simply that a distracted brewer made more mistakes and the result reflected that. But you had come to treat it as true regardless, because the outcomes were better when you did. You stood at the bench for a moment before beginning, and let your hands rest flat on the old wood, and breathed. The smell of the room. The warmth from the brazier, radiating gently against your side. The faint sound of Marin moving quietly in the front of the shop. She had taken out her knitting at some point, you thought. You could hear the small rhythmic sound of it, soft and regular. You thought about the people who would buy these bottles tomorrow. Not in a concerned way. Not wondering about their troubles or their losses. Simply holding them gently in mind. The grief ease was not a cure for grief, and it had never claimed to be. It did a smaller, softer thing than that. It eased the weight of it slightly, the way a good night's sleep eases almost everything slightly, not by taking the thing away, but by giving the person bearing it enough rest to keep going. You had seen it work, and you believed in it with a quiet and uncomplicated faith. Someone would buy one of these bottles tomorrow. They would be glad of it. There was a woman who had come in last spring, a few weeks after the cold that had taken her husband. You had known them both, as you know most people in a town this size. Not well, not closely, but enough to nod to on the street, enough to know their names and their faces. She had sat on the stool across the counter for a long time without saying very much, and then she had asked, very quietly, whether you had anything that might help with the quality of the nights. That had been how she put it, the quality of the nights. You had known what she meant. You had given her the grief ease and told her how to take it, and she had thanked you in the way that people thank you when the thanks is covering something much larger, and she had gone. She had come back in June. She had looked, not better, exactly, because grief doesn't work in those clean increments. But she had looked rested. She had looked, you thought, like a person who had slept. And she had brought you a small pot of her blackberry preserves, which she said she'd been making again for the first time this year, and you had accepted it with the understanding that the exchange meant something beyond preserves and payment. You began. Rose petals first, dried, deep red, from the garden of the forest which who brought them herself at the start of this month, wrapped in a cloth that smelled of her hearth. She had said nothing about them when she left them, just set them on the counter and given you a look that said she knew what they were for. The rose petals have a quality to them that ordinary dried roses from the market don't. You've used both and you know the difference. These smell of something more than flowers, something older, something that belongs to the deep part of the bramble where the forest is very old and very quiet. You add them to the bowl with both hands, slowly. They are lighter than they look, the petals, in spite of being dried, they carry a certain softness still. A suggestion of a former resilience. You handle them gently, as a matter of habit, and as a matter of something else less easy to name. Then the hawthorn berries, a small amount, just a handful, bruised lightly before going in. You press each one against the bench with the flat of a small spoon. Firm, once, not crushing. A release. The smell of them rises as they bruise, sweet, slightly astringent, the smell of late summer's last gifts, the smell of hedgerows and harvest and the knowledge that the year is ending. Not sadly. Just, honestly. The smell of autumn that is not about loss but about completion. Then the linden flowers, pale and papery, which smell of nothing much until they hit the water, at which point they bloom into something warm and faintly honeyed and surprisingly gentle. Then a single small piece of dried orange peel, dark with age, which you have had in a jar for a long time and which you add to the grief ease because you find its smell, warm and slightly bittersweet, like something cherished, seems to belong in this particular blend. The water goes in. You watch it spread through the bowl, darkening the rose petals to near black, lifting the hawthorn berries so they bob gently in the current of the pour. The steam rises carrying all of it upward together, rose and hawthorn and linden and something faintly sweet and dark from the orange peel, and underneath it all, You notice every time you are slightly moved by it, a quality that has no single source, just a warmth that seems to come from the combination itself. Something that smells, quietly, like being held. You stand over the bowl for a long moment and simply let the steam rise around your face. Your eyes are soft and unfocused. The back room is warm. The lamp's honey-orange light lies across the bench and the bowl and your hands. After a while you step back. You let it steep. The grief needs longer than the others. You have learned not to rush it. The color it produces, when it has steeped long enough, is a deep garnet red. Not like wine exactly, more saturated than that, more opaque, with a quality of depth that you find difficult to look away from. You set a cloth over the bowl and let it proceed at its own pace, and you go back through the curtain into the front of the shop to eat the second honey cake and drink the last of the slightly too steeped chamomile tea and wait. While the grief steeped, you came back out to the front of the shop and sat down across from Marin again. She had, as you'd thought, taken out her knitting. It was something gray, the beginning of something, not yet far enough along to know what it wanted to be. She worked it with the easy rhythm of long practice, her eyes moving between the needles and the window, where the street outside was dark now except for the warm circles of the lamp-posts on Sable Street. You sat with your mug of tea, you'd made yourself one while working, chamomile from Marin's bag, sitting in its pot since the start of the evening, slightly too steeped now but still good, still warm. Did you go to the square today? You asked. To see the setup? I walked through, Marin said. They've hung the lanterns already. The ones with the copper frames. The good ones. The good ones, yes. She looped a stitch. Someone's built a shelter over the far stall, the one that always floods if it rains during the fair. You can see whoever that was learned from last year. Was it Oswin's stall? It was his stall last year that flooded. Marin considered. It might have been. You know how he is about his books. I imagine he decided to take precautions. You thought of Oswin Greer, the head librarian, who arrived at any situation involving his books with a kind of gentle but implacable seriousness that you had always found rather admirable, and smiled into your mug. Last year he had spent the harvest fair with an expression of quiet stoic endurance, while the rain turned the far corner of Market Square into a shallow pond that crept under the legs of his display table. He had sold 6 books regardless and called it a success. But you imagined he had spent the subsequent year thinking about shelter. I've got 3 bottles for his table, you said. He asked me last week. Clarity tonic. 1 of those. 1 sleep draught. And 1 grief ease, which he said he didn't particularly need himself but thought someone else might. Marin was quiet for a moment, her needles working. That was thoughtful of him, she said. It was. You agreed. The candle between you had burned down a little since the beginning of the evening. The flame was steady now, not flickering, burning in that particular settled way that candles do when there is no draught and the wax is warm and everything is simply proceeding as it should. You watched it for a moment. Just that, the flame, steady, in its small pool of melted wax. The 3rd set, you said eventually. I need to think about what to make. What sort of thing were you thinking? Marin asked. Something for the fair, you said, turning your mug slowly in your hands. Something seasonal. Something people would want this time of year specifically. Marin set her knitting in her lap. She had a particular quality, when she was thinking, of becoming very still. What does autumn feel like to you? She said. Not what does autumn mean. What does it feel like? You thought about it. The warmth of the brazier behind you. The smell of wood smoke that had been in the air all day from every chimney on Sable Street. The particular satisfaction of closing shutters against the dark. The desire, in the evenings, to simply be still. Like permission, you said, after a while. To stop moving. To be inside. Marin looked at you steadily. There, she said. That's your third blend. You were back at the bench, turning the idea over, when the bell rang again. You heard Marin say something in the front room, and then a voice you recognized at once. Low and deliberate, every word landing with the comfortable weight of long habit. Aldemar Fenwick. He was already settled on the stool by the time you came through the curtain, though you had not been gone more than a few seconds. He had the particular quality of old Aldemar, which was that he seemed to have been wherever he was for considerably longer than was physically possible. He was a large man, wide in the shoulders, with white hair and a beard he kept short and a face that had been weathered by 60-odd years of early mornings in a bakery. He had flour on his forearm, as he almost always did, and he was holding a paper bag in both hands with the careful manner of someone transporting something that matters. I thought you might still be here, he said, looking at you with the slow deliberate focus of someone whose eyes have spent too many decades reading fine print. Working late. Fair bottles, you said. He nodded as though this confirmed something. I've got something for you, he said, and held out the paper bag. Inside, wrapped in the bag's brown paper, were 4 honey cakes. They were the small round ones that Fenwick's bakery made only in autumn, barely bigger than a full palm, dense and golden, flavored with the autumn spices that were the Fenwick family's particular secret. They smelled, even wrapped, of cinnamon and something darker, more resinous. And underneath that, honey, of course. Good clear honey. From the batch this afternoon, he said. We've more than we need for tomorrow's stall. You never have more than you need, Marin said, from her stool, without looking up from her knitting. This once, Aldemar said, with great dignity. You set the bag beside your mug and thanked him, and for a while the three of you sat in the amber light of the front shop while Aldemar talked about the game with the rings and the post. It was a tossing game, it emerged, which he had played as a boy and which he had been rebuilding from memory with the help of his second son, who was an enthusiast and had reportedly been practicing in the back garden. You listened with genuine pleasure, watching the way he used his hands when he talked, the flower on his forearm catching the candlelight. The night outside had gone fully dark. Through the shop window you could see the lamp post on Sable Street making its small warm circle on the wet cobblestones. It had begun to drizzle at some point, the gentlest possible drizzle, barely more than a thickening of the air. The street was empty and gleaming. When Aldemar went, at his own unhurried pace, with several pauses at the door to remember additional things he had meant to say. You ate one of the honey cakes while standing at the counter, and it was, as Fenwick's honey cakes always were, exactly the thing. You were still holding the paper bag when the bell above the door rang a second time. Bramble Oast came in out of the lane looking slightly breathless, which for Bramble was unusual. She moved, generally, with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has been running an inn for 20 years and long since made peace with the fact that things would arrive when they arrived. She was a broad-shouldered woman in a canvas apron that she had apparently not removed before leaving the inn, and she had a large basket over one arm and the expression of someone who has remembered something mid-errand. I saw Aldemar coming out, she said, by way of greeting. I thought I might just catch you. You have, you said. Come in properly. She came in, setting the basket on the counter beside the honey cake bag. She looked at the honey cake bag. He brought cakes, she said. He had extra, apparently. Bramble made a sound that suggested she and Marin held similar views on this claim. He never has extra. But she said it with the affection of long familiarity, and accepted the honey cake you offered her without further commentary. In her basket was a small crock of salt butter, the good kind, slightly grainy, the kind she made herself from the cream she got from the farm on the hill road above Fenwick Lane, and under that, a flask of something. Cider, she said, following your eyes. Last of the autumn batch. It's a good one this year. I thought, if you were here working late, it might be welcome. It very much is, you said. Bramble settled her elbows on the counter in the way she does. She is not someone who uses stools when she can lean, a habit born of decades of standing at a bar where leaning was simply more practical, and looked around the front of the shop with the familiar appreciation of a woman who has been coming here for years. Her eyes moved across the shelves, the amber bottles, the green ones, the little labels tied with brown twine. What are you making tonight? She asked. Fair bottles, you said. Sleep draught and clarity tonic are done. Working on grief ease next, and then something new. She nodded slowly. I'll take one of the grief ease, if you've a spare. She said it simply and without particular weight. Not for anything specific. I just find them useful. Of course, you said. You made a small note to yourself, one grief ease for Bramble. She had never said why she found them useful, and you had never asked, and that was the right way of things. Marin came through from the back of the shop. She had gone to check the brazier, which had been her idea and which you had appreciated, and took in Bramble at the counter with the easy acknowledgement of two people who know each other well. Bramble, she said. Marin, said Bramble. How are the shawl numbers? Marin looked down at the knitting in her hands, which was still in its early indeterminate stage. I believe it's going to be a shawl, she said, with the measured certainty of someone issuing a verdict that is still subject to appeal. Bramble looked at the knitting for a moment. It could also be a blanket. It could, Marin allowed. We'll see. This satisfied both of them. Bramble poured 3 small cups of cider from the flask, the innkeeper in her finding cups without being shown where they were, with the particular competence of someone who knows where cups are kept in any kitchen, and you sat for a while in the easy warmth of each other's company while the cider went around. It was good cider. She had not been wrong about the autumn batch. It was dry and slightly spiced, and had that characteristic of the best autumn ciders, which is that it smelled of apples and tasted of something slightly beyond apples, the particular alchemy of fruit and cold air and time. You turned your small cup in your hands and felt the warmth of it through the ceramic and thought, briefly and contentedly, that evenings like this were a reason enough for almost anything. I'd better get back, Bramble said at length, finishing her cider and setting the cup down with the finality of someone whose break was exactly the length she intended it to be. I've got the 8 o'clock dinner crowd in 40 minutes. She smoothed her apron. The crock is for you to keep. The butter. Thank you, Bramble. You'll come to the fair tomorrow. I'll have a stall. She looked at the row of bottles just visible through the curtain into the back room, with the expression of someone doing brief math in their head. A good one, she said. And then she was gone, the bell above the door chiming after her, the sound of the lane briefly present and then closing off again as the door settled shut. You looked at the crock of butter on the counter, then at the remaining honey cakes. There were 3 left, which was a very satisfactory number. The third blend came to you while you were eating. The idea had been sitting just at the edge of your thinking all evening, the way ideas in this shop have a habit of doing, approaching gently, waiting until you weren't trying so hard. You finished the last crumbling edge of the honey cake and licked the sweetness from your fingers, and there it was, fully formed. Warmth keep, you thought. A harbor tonic. Something that does what the shop itself does, creates the interior feeling of being inside when the cold is outside. Not a sleep draught, not a clarity blend. Something that simply makes the warmth feel more warm. You know the components already, as soon as you name the goal. You have been making individual elements of this for years without knowing they wanted to be put together. Ginger, dried, not too much, for the warmth that starts in the chest and moves outward. Cardamom, for the spice that is sweet and deep at once. The dried hawthorn berries again, because they are the taste of autumn and you want that seasonality in this one. A small amount of black pepper. Very small, careful, because you have found that the tiniest amount deepens everything around it without announcing itself. And something you have been thinking about for weeks. Dried apple, the kind from the braided strings that hang in Greenmere's window every autumn, which have been slowly giving off a smell of concentrated sweetness and dried wood and the memory of fruit all season. You went to the shelves and gathered each thing in turn. The ginger was in a small crock, pale gold and papery when dried. You crumbled a small amount between your fingers over the bowl, and your hands smelled instantly of warmth. The cardamom, this was the tricky one proportions-wise, went in next. Just the seeds from a few green pods, cracked gently with the flat of a small stone. They smelled of something almost perfumed, complex, simultaneously sweet and something harder to name. The dried apple you had to cut from its braided string with a small knife. The slices were brown and papery and light, and they smelled, as you worked, of October. Just October. Distilled and concentrated and slightly wistful. You thought of what Marin had said. Permission to stop moving. The black pepper was measured out over a small spoon. You watched each grain. This part always required attention. You added it to the bowl last, and the smell changed immediately. It deepened, as if a bottom note had been added to a piece of music, as if the melody had suddenly found its foundation. You breathed in over the bowl for a long moment with your eyes closed. Right, you thought. That is right. The water. The Harbour Bell rang the 9th hour while the warmth keep steeped. You heard it muffled through the stone walls of the shop, each note arriving slightly softened, the way the Harbour Bell always sounds when the air is damp. 9 strokes, measured, unhurried, each one hanging in the air before the next. Marin had moved to the chair by the window, the old one with the faded cushion that has been there since before your time in the shop. You could hear her knitting still, and occasionally the small sound of her setting it down to look out at the street. There was something profoundly restful about the sound of her presence. You had told her this once, and she had said she felt the same about yours, and neither of you had found it necessary to say anything more on the subject. While the warmth keep steeped, you began to prepare the labels. The labels were small cards, cut from thick paper, tied to the bottles with a loop of brown twine. You had already written most of them earlier in the week in your careful, somewhat crowded handwriting. Sleep draught, clarity tonic, grief ease. But the third batch needed a label, and you spent a few minutes now with a small pen and the ink pot, writing the name of the new blend in your best hand. Warmth keep, you wrote, because that is what it is. Then, under it, in smaller writing, autumn. Just that. Autumn. You thought that was enough. You were finishing the last of the warmth keep bottles, tilting the jug, watching the deep amber-brown liquid rise in the pale green glass, when the bell rang a third time. This was a different ring. You heard Marin say something you couldn't make out, and then a voice you knew very well indeed. Not because it was loud but because Pip Lark had a quality to their voice. Young, slightly earnest, with the habit of saying one extra word at the end of things, that made them immediately recognizable. Pip was 15 and had been running errands in Thistlewick for as long as anyone could remember needing errands run. They had dark eyes and muddy boots regardless of the weather, and they were, at this moment, apparently standing in your shop with something to deliver. "It's a note," Pip said, as you came through the curtain. "From the library. Oswin said it wasn't urgent, but he wanted you to have it tonight because he thought you might be here still and it would save him coming in the morning." You took the note. It was folded once and written on library stationery. Oswin had library stationery, which was one of many things you admired about him. The note, in his precise hand, said, "I find myself in need of a fourth bottle for tomorrow's table. After thinking it over, if you have one to spare of anything, I would be grateful. Entirely fine if not. Oh gee." You looked at the note for a moment, then at the 12 bottles lined up on the bench. "Tell him yes," you said. "Tell him I have one. I'll bring it to him in the morning." Pip nodded with the satisfying decisiveness of someone whose errand is concluded. "I'll tell him. Oh, and Marin, Oswin said to tell you that the book you wanted came in." Marin looked up from her knitting. The expression that crossed her face was quiet and pleased. "Did it?" she said. "It did. It's set aside for you." "I'll come Thursday," she said. "Thank you, Pip." Pip nodded once more, looked around the shop with the brief and genuine appreciation of someone who has been coming here since childhood and has never quite stopped finding it wonderful, and went back out into the drizzle. The bell chimed softly. Faded. You stood looking at the 12 bottles for a moment. Then you went to the shelf under the bench and found a 13th bottle, slightly different in shape from the others, rounder at the base, which was why it hadn't gone in the crate with the rest. You held it up to the lamp. Pale green. No cracks. You looked at the small amount of warmth keep remaining in the jug, enough for one more bottle if you were careful. You poured it. The 13th bottle sat slightly apart from the others, in the warmer color of the lamp rather than the cooler light near the window. Its amber-brown content caught the light differently than the others. The warmth keep had a depth to it, a layeredness, that the other blends didn't quite have. You stood looking at the row of bottles for a while. All 13 of them. The sleep draughts in their warm amber, the clarity tonics in their jade, the grief ease in their deep garnet, the warmth keeps in their layered brown gold. "Are you done?" Marin asked from the doorway. She had come to look, the way she had come to look at the clarity tonic earlier. "I think so," you said. She looked at the bottles in silence for a moment. Then, "They're beautiful." They were, you thought, in the particular way of things that are made carefully, in a warm room, over a long quiet evening. "The 13th is for Oswin," you said. "I wondered," she said. "Which one?" "Warmth keep." She considered this. "He'll like that. He's always cold in that library." She paused. "Although he'd never say so." "I know." You began to wrap the bottles, carefully, each one in its own piece of soft cloth, set into the wooden carrying crate with a layer of wood shavings between them. The crate was old, the wood gray with use. It had come with the shop. You suspected it had come with the shop before this shop, if that made any sense, had been carried through other doors and set on other benches. The wrapping was a pleasant task. Each bottle, warm in your hands, fragrant even through its cork, felt like something complete. Something finished. You set them in the crate one at a time, settling each into its place among the wood shavings, until all 13 were in and the crate was full and you could put the lid on. You put the lid on. You set the crate by the door. Done. I'll make tea, Marin said. A proper cup. Not from the pot that's been sitting there since you arrived. The pot is fine, you said. The pot is cold, she said. And oversteeped. She was already moving, with the comfortable authority of someone who knows their way around someone else's kitchen, to fill the kettle from the small tap over the sink in the back room. You heard the water running. The sound of the kettle being set on the brazier, which had burned down considerably from its earlier heat, but still had plenty to give. You went back out to the front of the shop and sat down behind the counter. The candle was low now, burned to a broad pooled base, the flame a little more uncertain than it had been at the start of the evening, but still steady. The front of the shop had taken on the feeling it gets late in the evening, a sort of deepened quiet, all the edges softened further by hours of warmth and the smell of good things being made. The bottles on the upper shelves glowed amber and green. The old wooden counter was warm under your hands. The drizzle outside had thickened slightly. You could hear it now, the faintest tapping against the window glass, irregular, soft. The lamp post on Sable Street made its glow through the water-beaded window, fractured into small warm shapes. You let yourself sit quietly. You let your eyes rest on the middle distance, neither looking at anything in particular nor looking away from anything. This is something you have become better at over the years you have spent in the shop. Simply being inside the moment without needing it to be different. The sound of Marin in the back room, the hiss of the kettle beginning to warm. The creak of the building. The distant harbor, its constant low voice. The smell of everything you've made tonight, hanging in the air like a kind of presence. Tomorrow will be the harvest fair, with its banners and its lampposts and its copper lanterns and Aldemar's ring and post game and Oswin's stall under its new shelter. People will come from all over the square to the fair, and some of them will find their way to your table, and some of them will take home one of the pale green bottles from the wooden crate, and some of those people, you believe this quietly but thoroughly, will be helped by what is inside. Tonight, though. Tonight is this. Marin brought the tea. She came through the curtain with 2 mugs, the big ones, the ones with the thick walls that keep things warm, and set them on the counter between you. The steam rose from both, and the smell of it was ordinary tea, the dark leaf kind, with something added. You breathed in and recognized it. Did you put cardamom in? You said. Just the tiniest amount, she said. I hope that's all right. Of course it's all right. You picked up the mug in both hands and felt the warmth of it spread through your palms. It's very good. The tea was, in fact, very good. Warm and slightly spiced, and with that particular quality that good late evening tea has, the sense of being exactly the right thing at exactly the right time, which is simpler than it sounds. I'll head home soon, Marin said, wrapping her own hands around her mug. I promised myself I wouldn't stay past 9:30. It's probably past that now, you said. Probably. She did not seem particularly troubled by this. You'll lock up properly? The window in back still sticks. I know. And you'll eat the rest of those honey cakes. I was going to. Good. She looked at you over the rim of her mug. Her eyes were steady and warm, the way they always are. It was a good evening. It was. You agreed. You sat like that for a while. How long is difficult to say, because time in the shop has always moved slightly differently from time outside it. Slowly, comfortably, the candle burned lower between you. The drizzle tapped against the window in its soft, irregular rhythm. The Harbour Bell, somewhere across the town, rang the half-hour, a single note, muffled by damp air, lingering. Marin finished her tea. She stood and gathered her shawl around her, and picked up her basket, lighter now, without the bread and cheese and the jar of plums, and said good night with the directness of someone who means it. "Sleep well," you said. "And you," she replied. "You've done good work tonight." The bell above the door chimed once as she went out. Soft. A question settling into an answer. Then she was gone, and you were alone with the shop. You sat for a few more minutes behind the counter. The mug of tea was still warm enough to drink. You finished it slowly, with both hands around it, watching the candle flame. The shop had gone very quiet, the particular quality of quiet that comes after company has left, which is different from the quiet of an empty room in the first place. This is a warm quiet. A quiet that still holds the shape of what just was. You thought about nothing in particular. After a while you got up and began to close up for the night. The back room first. The brazier needed banking, which meant placing the metal cover over it with care, pressing it down until the coals were smothered to a slow glow that would last the night without becoming anything more. The lamp you turned down slowly, watching the flame lower and then go out, leaving behind a brief thread of smoke and the familiar smell of cooled oil. The bench you wiped down with a damp cloth, a habit so ingrained you do it without thinking, your hands moving through the familiar pattern of it while your mind drifted pleasantly. The steeping bowls you rinsed in the sink and set upside down on the drying shelf. The bottles and tinctures you returned to their shelves, the valerian to the back, the river eye to the third shelf, the ginger crock to its place between the cardamom and the dried orange peel. You ran your hand along the shelf as you stepped back from it, the way you often do. The jars and crocks and bottles, all in their places. The back room was dark now except for the faint glow of the banked brazier, just visible around the edges of the cover. You went back through the curtain into the front of the shop. The candle had burned itself nearly out. It was a puddle of wax now, the flame barely a breath, dancing very gently. You watched it for a moment. It was not going to last much longer, and you were glad of it, glad of having been here for its whole evening, from its first clean-smelling start down to this near end. Then you cupped your hand beside it and blew, very softly, and the flame went out. The shop was dark except for the lamp-post light coming through the window. It made everything into softer versions of itself, the bottles on the shelves, the counter, the stool, the wooden crate by the door with its load of 13 bottles sleeping in their wood shavings. You took your coat from the crooked hook. You put it on and buttoned it. You picked up the crate, carefully, both hands, testing the weight, which was good and solid and exactly what it should be, and set it by the door. You would come by in the morning before the fair opened and collect it. But for now, it was ready. Everything was ready. The window in the back room did stick, as it always did. You went back through the curtain one more time and wrestled it into place with the familiar sequence of lift and push that you have long since memorized, and you heard it click shut and felt the small satisfaction of something closed properly against the cold. Then you came back through. One last look at the front of the shop. The amber bottles on the shelves. The dark, worn counter. The stool where Marin had sat. The wooden crate. The small brass leaf bell above the door, just visible in the dim light from outside. Everything the same as it always is. Everything as it should be. Outside, Sable Street was quiet in the drizzle. You stood for a moment in the doorway, not quite ready to leave the warmth of the shop for the cool of the lane. The lamp post directly across the way had been burning long enough that it was steady now, its flame no longer dancing, its circle of light on the wet cobblestones an even and dependable thing. A few of the cobblestones caught the light differently than the others. The larger ones with a slight curve to their surface held a sheen of water that made them almost mirror-like, dark and reflective. You had always liked the way Sable Street looked in the rain. You pulled the door behind you and heard the latch catch. The bell above the door made its last, small, leaf-shaped sound, barely audible through the closed door, and then the shop was sealed for the night, the warmth and the smell of it contained behind the old wood and glass. You turned up your collar and walked. The cobblestones were wet, and they caught the lamp-post light in small bright pools that shifted as you walked. The drizzle was the kind that you barely feel on your face, barely more than the sense of dampness in the air itself, like walking through something that hasn't quite decided to become rain. It smelled of wet stone and wood smoke, and very faintly, from somewhere down toward the harbor, the salt of the water. The salt smell came and went. It depended on the direction of the wind, and tonight the wind was very faint and occasional, moving through the lane and then disappearing, leaving the air still again. Your footsteps on the cobblestones. That was the only sound as you walked the length of Sable Street, the dull, slightly muffled sound of boots on wet stone. It was a sound you had walked to for many years, through many seasons. You knew this street in all its weathers, the way the puddle at the south end of it collected after significant rain, the way the lamp post at the bend flickered whenever the sea wind was high, the way the cobblestones here, the oldest in this part of town, had worn into a very slight bowl in the center from a century of foot traffic, so that rainwater channeled gently toward the middle, and ran in a thin dark line toward the drain at the corner. The town was almost entirely settled for the night. The chandlery across from the shop was dark. Its sign hung still in the damp air, a carved flame, painted gold once, worn now to a dull warmth. The lamp-posts on Sable Street made their small gentle pools at even intervals, each one an island of warmth in the dark. Somewhere ahead and to the left, around the corner near the apothecary, you could hear someone's window shutter being closed against the damp, a soft wooden sound, a latch clicking home. Then that sound faded. The only sounds were the drizzle, very quiet on the rooftops, and your own footsteps. At the end of Sable Street you paused. From here you could see the edge of Market Square. The banners for the harvest fair were up, and in the drizzle they hung straight and quiet, the deep red and gold of them dulled by the wet to something softer, more muted, though no less beautiful for that. In the day they would be vivid and crisp. Tonight they were the color of deep autumn, the color of the season itself. The copper lanterns that Marin had mentioned were dark now. They would be lit tomorrow. But you could see the shapes of them suspended between the lamp-posts, small and still, like seeds waiting. The stalls were set up and covered for the night. White canvas over the tables, tied down against the weather. The fair, sleeping. You let your eyes move across it slowly. The covered stalls, the dark lanterns, the banners. The stone well in the center with its iron handle. And at the very heart of the square, the old oak. Its branches were bare now, or nearly so, a few of the last leaves still clinging, dark against the sky. In the drizzle, the bark of it was dark, and the branches held small beads of water that caught the lamp-post light in tiny, scattered sparks. It was very still, not as a thing frozen, but as a thing that had simply decided to rest. as a thing that had always rested in precisely this way, in this spot, on nights like this one, for longer than anyone knew. You stood and looked at the oak for a long while. It had a way of doing this to you sometimes, making you stop. Not from any dramatic feeling, nothing so large. Just a kind of settling that happened when you looked at something old enough and patient enough. Something about the scale of its years relative to your own. Something comfortable rather than humbling, like standing next to someone much taller who is simply good at standing. Then you turned toward home. The walk was not long. The streets between the shop and home were familiar in the way that everything is familiar here, not requiring any attention, simply present and known, like a song you have heard so many times you can hear it without listening. The creak of the third step on Fenwick Lane, as you passed the foot of it, heard even from the lane below, in the still damp night. The smell of Fenwick's bakery, faint but unmistakable, bread and yeast and autumn spice, even at this hour, because Aldemar would be starting the morning's baking soon and the ovens were already warming. The smell stopped you for a moment. Bread in the night air, warm and yeasty and carrying the particular richness of the autumn spice blend, was one of those smells that did something to you in the chest. Something that was not quite nostalgia, or not only nostalgia, but was something more present than that. The smell of a town that bakes its bread before dawn, every day, in all seasons. The smell of continuity, of the world persisting in its small and important habits. You stood in the lane for a moment with the smell of the bakery around you, and the drizzle soft on your face, and the lamp post at the end of the lane making its small warm circle on the wet stone. You walked on. You walked slowly. There was no reason to hurry. The night was quiet, and the drizzle was soft, and the town was as it always is. Settled, old, breathing, holding itself around you with a kind of steady warmth that you have never found anywhere else. You had been here long enough that the streets knew your footsteps. Long enough that the shop knew your particular way of breathing. Long enough that the smell of chamomile and beeswax was simply the smell of you, carried with you everywhere you go. Past the stone wall with a moss on it. The moss was very green in the damp, greener than it looks in the daytime, a deep saturated color that seemed almost to glow in the lamp post light. You trailed your hand along it as you passed. The moss was cool and slightly wet under your fingers, and soft in the way that only very old moss is soft, yielding completely, as though offering no resistance at all. You let your hand rest against it for a few steps before dropping it back to your side. Past the cottage with the kitchen garden, where the hollyhocks were long since gone for the year, and the garden beds were turned and composted and given over to their winter sleep. The compost smell rose faintly even in the rain, earthy, organic, the smell of things becoming other things. The gate to this garden has a latch that makes a particular clicking sound when the wind moves it. Tonight the air was still, and the latch was silent. A cat sat on the windowsill of the cottage next door, visible through the glass, watching the street with the half-closed eyes of a creature who has decided that the night is satisfactory. It did not react to your passing. You recognized it. A large gray thing that spent its summers in the alley beside the chandlery, and its winters, apparently, on windowsills. You had never known its name, if it had one. It had the expression of a creature that considered names a human concern. The Harbour Bell rang the 10 o'clock hour. The notes came one at a time, slow and measured, traveling across the town in the damp night air, arriving slightly muffled at your ears. The fog and the drizzle made every sound in Thistlewick a little softer, a little rounder, as though the air was patting the edges of things. You counted the notes without intending to, 1, 2, 3, each one hanging for a moment before the next arrived. 4, 5, 6. The 7th note, and then the 8th note, which arrived with the slight hush of all final things. And then the 9th. And then the 10th. 10 o'clock. Somewhere between the 7th and 8th you had stopped walking and simply stood, on the wet cobblestones at the end of an ordinary lane in Thistlewick, and listened to the last 2 notes of the bell fade into the sound of the drizzle on the rooftops. You listened until the sound was completely gone, until you could no longer tell whether what you were hearing was the last faint resonance of the bell, or simply the silence of the night. Then you walked the last few steps home. Your own gate. The familiar latch, cool under your hand. The hinges made no sound. You had oiled them 2 weeks ago and were still finding a quiet satisfaction in the result, the way a small task done well repays itself over and over in small, quiet ways. The garden path was 3 steps, and then the door. The door fit well in its frame. It always had. This was something about the house that you had appreciated from the first time you stepped into it, many years ago. The door fit well, the windows sealed properly, the floors didn't slope too badly. It had been built, or maintained, by people who took a certain care. Evidence of long, ordinary, attentive lives. The same comfort as the rings on the workbench. The same thing that made old Thistlewick reassuring rather than merely old. You went in. Inside, the house was warm. You had banked the fire before supper, and it was still going. Just a low red glow in the grate that asked only to be left alone. You left it alone. You set your coat over the back of the chair by the door, and unlaced your boots and set them beside it. And for a moment you stood in your stockings in the middle of the room, and felt the warmth of the floor coming up through the wool, and felt the day finish. The feeling of a day finishing. You had come to recognize this sensation over the years, the particular way the body announces that it has done what it came to do and can now be still. It was not tiredness exactly, though tiredness was part of it. It was something more complete than tiredness. A fullness. The evening had been good, the shop, the work, the visitors, the warmth keep coming right, Marin's tea, Aldemar's cakes, Bramble's cider. These were not extraordinary things. They were the ordinary fabric of a good life in a good place, and you felt their weight in you now in the most pleasant way, as completeness. The room smelled faintly of this morning's fire and the bread you'd had for supper, and just slightly, carried in on your coat, and in your hair, and on your hands, the smell of the shop. Chamomile, beeswax, rose petals, ginger and cardamom, from the warmth keep. Something that was simply the smell of being in that room, making those things, in that particular warmth. You looked at the room. The table, with the single chair where you had eaten. The window showing the dark outside, the lamp post at the end of the lane, the puddle of light on the wet stones. The shelves with their books and their accumulated small things. The flat gray stone from the harbor that you picked up on a summer morning and carried home in your pocket and never saw any reason to stop keeping. The small painted tile that came with the house and which you had always meant to learn the history of and never quite had. The blue jar with a broken rim that holds pens and spare lengths of twine, and a button that has been waiting to be reunited with whatever garment it came from for longer than you can accurately say. The rug in front of the fire, which had been here before you, and had long since given up most of its original pattern to a comfortable, unified brown-gray that you found, if anything, more appealing than whatever bright colors it might have started with. The worn places where you had stood, year after year, warming your hands before the fire in the mornings. The chair. You sat down in it. The chair was the right kind of old, the kind where the cushions have adapted to a specific person, where the arms sit at exactly the right height, where the back has developed a slight lean that just happens to match the lean you prefer. You settled into it the way you settle into something that knows you. The fire made very little sound now. The coals had settled into themselves over the hours since you had banked it, and the glow they gave was not the active glow of burning but the deep slow glow of stored warmth releasing itself gradually into the room. This was the best kind of fire to sit by, the kind that requires nothing and gives everything. Just warmth, constant and patient, from the depth of the coals. You let your eyes rest on it. 13 bottles in their crate, back at the shop. Ready for the morning. The sleep draughts in their warm amber, the clarity tonics in their jade, the grief ease in their deep garnet, the warmth keeps in their layered brown gold, each one a small completed thing. Tomorrow the harvest fair. Aldemar's ring game and Oswin's sheltered stall, and the copper lanterns lit, and the smell of the square full of wood smoke and autumn and Fenwick spice bread sold by the slice. You would take your crate to your table early, before the crowd came, when the square was still quiet, and the lanterns were being lit, and the smell of the morning was cold and clean, and smelled of the banners and the damp oak and the far-off harbor. You would arrange the bottles in their rows and put the small sign on the corner of the table, the one in your own handwriting, potions and tonics, gentle remedies, and then you would stand behind your table and wait, and the morning would unfold the way mornings unfold, moment by moment, unhurried. Marin would come early, she'd said, before the crowd, and then the day would be full of small things, conversations over the table, the particular pleasure of matching the right bottle to the right person, the comfortable exhaustion of standing in the autumn air for several hours, the smell of everything baking and spiced. Bramble carrying cups of something warm from the inn across the square for the stall-holders mid-morning, as she always did. Pip appearing from various directions with various errands. Oswin, very probably, rearranging his books at least 3 times before settling on an arrangement he found acceptable. You would be tired by the end of it. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was this, the low fire, the wet street outside, the smell of the shop still on your hands, the warmth of the room around you, the particular, specific peace of an evening well spent, settling into your bones. You leaned your head back against the chair. Outside, the drizzle continued its quiet work on the rooftops and the windows and the cobblestones of Thistlewick. Not rain, still, not quite. Just the damp air giving itself slowly to the ground. The sound of it was very soft. It was the kind of sound you could stop hearing, if you let your attention ease enough, and then find again. There it is, a soft continuous whisper across the glass. You let your attention ease. The fire. The warmth of the room. Your hands in your lap, still carrying the faint herbal ghost of the evening's work. You raised one hand slowly and brought it to your face and breathed in, chamomile, yes, still. The ghost of the rose petals. Something warm and slightly spiced from the warmth keep, the cardamom, maybe, which clings to the skin. The faintest trace of valerian, earthy and deep, barely there but present. The smell of the evening. The smell of the shop. You let your hand rest back in your lap. The coals shifted, very gently, once. The sound of it was barely there. A settling sound. The sound of something going further into its rest. You let your own breath slow in, and the warm air of the room, the faint smell of all those things, the wood smoke, the chamomile, and out, slowly, all the way out, the breath leaving without hurry, the chest falling, the shoulders releasing. In, out. The drizzle on the glass. The soft red glow through your closed eyes. The warmth coming up from the floor through the rug, coming from the fire, coming from the house itself, which had been holding warmth in its old stone walls since long before tonight, and would go on doing so long after. You are in Thistlewick. You are in the chair by the fire. You have had a good evening, and the work is done, and the bottles are ready, and your friends were here, and the world is exactly as it should be. Somewhere over the harbour, beyond the rooftops, the water moved against the old stone docks in its endless patient rhythm. The same rhythm it had made last night and the night before and 100 autumns before you were here to hear it. It moved now, as it always did, slow and low and certain, the sound of something that has always known exactly what it is doing. In, out. The harbour bell will ring again in an hour. But you will not hear it, or if you do you will hear it only distantly, folded into sleep the way all sounds here fold eventually. Gently, without urgency, without waking. Everything is fine. You are here. You are home. The rain comes down very softly on Thistlewick, on the market square and the covered stalls and the dark copper lanterns, on the old oak which does not mind, on the harbour and the fishing boats in their moorings, on the cobblestones of Sable Street, and on the potion shop on Sable Street, and on the small brass bell above its door. On Fenwick Lane, where the smell of the morning bread is just beginning. On the library, where Bindle has claimed a chair by the cold stove and curled into a shape of perfect, unself-conscious warmth. On all of it. On this town that has been here a very long time and knows it. The fire keeps its low warmth. The night holds its breath. And the town of Thistlewick settles into sleep around you, as it always has, and will, and does. Easy as breathing, quiet as a candle going out, certain as the tide.